I'm Susan Sokol Blosser. I was the first director of the International Pinot Noir celebration and did that for a few years. I can't remember exactly how many. And it was really an incredible experience because what we called ourselves the International Pinot Noir celebration, but we were just a bunch of local folks, and we grew into the name, which was really wonderful. So as we celebrate 25 years, it's amazing to look back and see the very humble beginnings that we started from.
So why don't you talk about what was the impetus for founding the IPNC?
Well, in 1997, which was the 10-year anniversary of the IPNC, a few people decided they would write a little history of it, and nobody could quite agree. Everyone had a different version of how it actually started. And I think the reason for that is that it really was an idea that came from a number of different arenas. So depending on which part of the elephant you were feeling, you had a different description. For example, the past presidents of the McMinnville Chamber of Commerce were looking for an economic development issue. Actually, a lot of communities in Yamhill County, where Newburgh was too, but McMinnville was better organized, so they got the prize. And they invited a few winery folks to come talk, and their idea was to have a competition or a fair or something like that, and the wineries directed it into a celebration rather than a competition. And the other groups that were interested was McMinnville Downtown Association was just getting going and was, I'm not sure if they actually had their designation as a historic district, but they were, if not, they were applying for it. And they wanted to bring more traffic to downtown, so they really appreciated that. Linfield was not quite on board at that point. This was a Baptist college with a history of, abstinence, and yet they were the perfect venue for this kind of event, which would be different than most wine events. For one thing, it wasn't a competition, and most, wines are just always rated by anybody who wants to rate them. And most events were A, held at resorts, B, sponsored by large corporations or agencies, the National Restaurant Association or American Express. So this would be held at a small residential college where we would take over the campus. It would be not sponsored by any big name, not presented by anyone, just our little group. And it would not be a competition, and it would bring together the top producers globally. So that meant primarily Burgundy and California and Oregon. And we included ourselves in that just out of our own vanity, and because we were holding it here, so we were going to be part of it. And the idea was to promote Oregon Pinot Noir, but we wanted to do it in a way that was collaborative. So the McMinnville Chamber of Commerce, the past president portion of it, gave us some money. I think it was $1,000. And that was, they had to argue about that, but finally did it. The Downtown Association supported us, not financially, but just with their excitement and ideas and so forth. And the wineries were all behind it, and the retailers locally were behind it. And we actually got an economic development grant from the state of Oregon to help us fund the initial one too. So that's how it all started.
Oh. So why don't you talk about that, I guess, that discussion about the notion of celebration and how that discussion went and why you settled on the term celebration as opposed to having a wine competition or a festival or something like that?
Well, you know, Burgundy, France has been the standard for Pinot Noir. And in 1985, so this was 2 years before the IPNC, there was a project that the Oregon Wine Center did, which was kind of a taste-off in New York that was, I think, 15 1983 Oregon Pinot Noirs against 10 or 12 Burgundian Pinot Noirs. And the tasters were sommeliers and wine writers and people who prided themselves on their fine palates. In Manhattan were invited to the International Wine Center to taste these wines blind, and they were asked to do 3 things. They were asked to rank their 5 favorites and to say whether they were from Oregon or Burgundy. Actually, that only asked to do 2 things. And what happened surprised everybody. It was the top 5 were all favorites, were all from Oregon. In fact, the top 2, I have to say this, were made by Sokol Blosser. And the tasters said that they couldn't distinguish which were Burgundian and which were Oregon. So that news, because it had a very high profile, just went around the country and in France as well. So the French we knew that if we wanted to put on a competition, the French would be this had happened recently enough that they would not come. So we decided, you know, we really want to promote Pinot Noir. Let's celebrate it. Let's celebrate what a food-friendly wine it is, what great camaraderie there is among Pinot Noir producers. And that's how we realized, I mean, it was a very pragmatic decision. This is how we're going to get other wineries from other regions to come participate.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of leads into the international part. You chose specifically also to make it an international celebration. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it had to be international, partly because if we wanted people to attend, we knew that they weren't going to attend just to taste our wines. They were going to attend for the chance to taste great Burgundian Pinot Noir. And in fact, at the tastings, it was always the French wine that was drunk first. People would rush to taste the French wines. And I think that may have stopped a little, or at least been mitigated by now, 25 years later, with the rise in importance of Oregon Pinot Noir. But at the time, we needed the French there for credibility. You know, this was before Robert Drouhin came to the United States. In fact, it was, we think, coming to the Pinot Noir celebration has been one of the things that brought him to the United States.
Mm-hmm. So you had, actually in a discussion we had with you last year, you actually talked about the creation of that first board. You kind of talked about how you sort of tried to make it maybe a little bit more international than it was. There was kind of an interesting, can you remember that story?
Oh, right. Well, no, the venue. Well, the board actually was, the initial board was composed of local winemakers and I mean, the actual operating board was local winemakers and local business people, and primarily McMinnville. And we had some artists because we wanted art and wine, and some chefs, you know, so it was really well-rounded in that sense. But we also had an honorary board that was composed of people that would give us credibility that we could put on our stationery when we invited other wineries. So the names that I remember were Serena Sutcliffe, who was a very prominent English wine writer, Neil Goldschmidt, who at that time was governor of Oregon, and I can't remember if Hugh Johnson was part of it, but I mean, we had big names. And that was because we weren't international, but we knew people who were, and we asked them if they would help us, and they did. And in getting the international wineries to come, we, members of the board who knew people, used their friendship to persuade them to come for this initial one, and they liked it and came back. So one other thing that I want to say about that is that the original idea was that we would have this at Linfield for a few years in Oregon, and then it would move to California, and then it would move to Burgundy, and it would move around. It would truly be international, and that was the original intention. So after a few years, I don't know if people have told you this already, but after a few years, we said to California, okay, it's your turn. And they said, we can't put this on. And they said, you keep doing it. And okay. And then we said to our Burgundian friends, it's your turn. And they said, are you kidding? We barely talk to each other. We can't put this on. So we kept it. But the original idea was that it would travel.
Actually, you anticipated my next question. That was going to be the one about the traveling around. So, what place does IPNC hold in Oregon wine history? Because you guys had been around for a while by then. By the time this started, there had been well over a decade of you
Right.
all having wine. So. You start this event, and so where would you situate this in terms of sort of Oregon wine history?
The International Pinot Noir celebration is one of the key centerpieces in making Oregon known for Pinot Noir, in making Oregon a tourist destination for wine lovers. Things had happened before. Irie had shown well at an international competition. All the wineries that showed really well in the 1985 Wine Center in New York that was the taste-off. And, little things, but nothing had the scope and really interfaced with the number of people that the International Pinot Noir celebration did. So I can't overstate how important I think the IPNC has been in positioning Oregon as a prominent Pinot Noir destination.
So not only were you part of the original idea and the founding members, you were also, were you the first director or one of the first directors?
Well, I was the first director,
okay,
and
so
what happened was that we had this great volunteer board, and everybody had lots of ideas, and we were going to do this and we were going to do that, and everybody had their own business that they were trying to run as well. And I, at that time, was managing our vineyards. Bill Blosser was running the winery. So I had some time, and I was really interested in this, and I made an offer to the board and said, I think you need somebody whose sole job is to get some of these things done. And I would be willing to do this for, I can't even remember what it was, $3,000 or $4,000 for the year. It was a modest sum. And they thought about it and said, fine. And so I became the staff person and went to the chamber and talked to Chris Brown, who was the director at that time, and she gave me the basement of the chamber to work out of, which was pretty dark and dank, but it worked, and that became my office, and we got a telephone and went from there. The really key part about the International Pinot Noir celebration, which has changed significantly since the beginning, was that with the exception of me as a staff person, it was totally volunteer. All the wine movements were volunteer. The coordination of the cooking and kitchen was volunteer. The art, we had a poster contest. I arranged that. I mean, it was the people serving the food and wine were the police chief and the head of the U.S. Bank and the head of Key Bank and the mayor, and people who were attending didn't realize that these luminaries were serving them their food. I mean, obviously we paid the kitchen staff at Linfield, but it was volunteers who pulled it off, did all the registration materials. My mother, who lived in McMinnville at that time, told me that all her friends in their 80s were folding napkins for days before for this event. So it was a community-wide event. Now, as we went on, we realized, this is a big deal. We've got to hire people to do this. But the first few years, it was all volunteers.
So why don't you talk about what it was like to organize all of that those first few years?
I can't believe I did it. I can't believe I did it. When I look back and I think we had this incredible poster contest, we had some fabulous artists do original work for this. We had a big show at Renshaw and Linfield, which at that time was the art department. We had a gift shop at the IPNC with local artists selling their grape jewelry and paintings and photographs and note cards and all kinds of things. We had a wine room that got wine to different places on campus and to meals. That was an engineering feat, logistical feat. We had chefs, we procured chefs that came from around the country and cooked meals in the very institutional kitchen at Linfield. So it was amazing. It was amazing. I don't think I slept very much during that time, but the volunteers we had were incredible. And particularly the ones for registration, and we had a few servers that maybe drank too much, but for the most part, it was really a fabulous community building event.
So what was that very first one like for you? Do you remember it?
It's sort of a haze in my memory. No, I can't say that I remember a lot about it.
What have you taken away as a result of your participation at IPNC? There's been, I think, both IPNC. It's an exchange of ideas. It's a community. I think people seem to have come out with lasting relationships from it. Jason Lett attributes it, at least in part, for his marriage. And so I think, what have you come out of this with from IPNC personally?
Well, I think because I was so much on the logistical side of it, for the many years that I attended it, was either director or on the board. And so I tend to see it from a procedural standpoint. And I think which means that I didn't just come and enjoy it. I was looking out to make sure that everything was done and done right. So in a sense, it was a job for me. But what I take away from that is the recognition of how much you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit, and how working together and the collaboration that the IPNC engendered has stood the Oregon wine industry in such good stead that it is something that people say is unique about the Oregon wine industry, certainly among other wine industries, but also in any industry. Yes, we are all competitors, but we have a recognition, at least among the early folks, that we have so much more to gain if we work together.
So can you, I think I mentioned earlier, we've had people from different sides of IPNC who have worked at, volunteers or directors or founders, share different memories, and there have been some really interesting stories told about. Do you have a real significant memory that you'd like to share about IPNC, that, either something that we've had, quasi-disastrous things, or just really sort of peak moments? Do you have anything in particular, any kind of story you'd like to share about IPNC?
Well, the one thing that comes to mind is that during the first year, or even the second year, I don't remember which one, I worked with a woman called Maggie Revis, who is no longer alive, but at that time was a founder of the Mid-Valley Workshop and a real community leader, and was wonderful to help me. I really relied on her a lot. She liked to refer to herself as my slave, which I got such a kick out of. But we would have things happen. Somebody would call and at the last minute be very demanding about something or complain about something, or something would fall through that we were counting on. And I have to say that those were the events that made things interesting. And she would complain about, oh my gosh, now we have to deal with this. And I would say, no, Maggie, this is what makes this exciting, is that the unexpected happens, and we have challenges, and this is where we have to use our brains and come up with how we fix them. And she'd say, oh yeah, you're right. And it just changed the whole mindset of how we would look at these challenges. And I can't remember a specific one. I just remember the feelings they engendered.
I think you've been one of the people with whom I've spoken about not just focusing on the wine, but the relationship between food and wine, that this just wasn't about, even when you guys first came here and planted, it wasn't about just the wine, it was about sort of a lifestyle, a culture. Can you talk about a little bit more about that relationship between the food and the wine?
Well, we really believe at Sokol Blosser that wine is part of a healthy, balanced lifestyle. Wine in moderation is part of a healthy, balanced lifestyle. And part of what we wanted to promote at the IPNC was, excuse me, an antidote to the anti-alcohol that was really quite prominent at that time and gaining momentum. And I joined a group in the 1990s called Women for Wine Sense, because the idea was that wine in moderation is good for you and adds to the quality of life. And we wanted to show that by combining great food and wine. So you have wonderful wine on one hand and you have great food on the other, and when you put them together, magic happens. Magic happens in your mouth. And we also wanted to include art in that. So, all the senses. And that's why we decided to have a poster contest. That we ended up finding that was too much work and for the payback, but it was great fun while we did it.
Mm-hmm. So when you started IPNC, then from the very beginning, you were doing this pairing of wine and food.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. And that we chose chefs that we thought would do well with food pairing. A lot of chefs are more interested in their food and they'll just put any wine with it. So it was important to find somebody who got it, who understood that if you have the right match, you raise both to another level.
Right. So how do you go about finding, I mean, do you have discussions with the chefs about that? How do you go about finding that out about
Well,
someone?
all of us had traveled enough and eaten in enough restaurants and knew enough chefs that we could identify people that we wanted to bring. And they also had to be people that would have some name recognition among wine aficionados, because those were the people we wanted to come. And the goal was to have, in terms of attendees, to have a number of industry people, wine distributors, wine retailers, wine writers, and just sophisticated consumers who liked Pinot Noir, so that there'd be enough education and enough technical part of the program for both of those groups, and they would all appreciate the food.
And it also sounds like, as I've spoken with different folks, that you already had a fairly good relationship with the Burgundy region, that a lot of you had gone and either spent time there or worked there.
Right, and particularly Dave Adelsheim and Dave Lett had international contacts and California contacts, because we had to talk our California friends into coming up here as well. So they didn't want to come to an Oregon show, so we had to prove that they would be equal partners, and this was not just about Oregon.
I think that's about all I have.
Jeff, can I ask a couple of questions?
Yeah, go.
This is unusual, we haven't done this before, but could you talk a little bit about Ken Patton's role in getting IPNC started, and sort of what his position was in the community and why that was important for the beginning of the celebration?
Well, Ken Patton, who at that time was head of the large Hewlett-Packard plant here, which was a key employer in Oregon, became a very important part of IPNC and in making it happen. He became the first president of the board, and we held a number of meetings at Hewlett-Packard. His secretary was very helpful in putting out minutes and getting things out for us. And his second in command, Bob Burnett, brought together a group of Hewlett-Packard engineers, and they are the ones who did the logistics for the wine movement. And if you can imagine a very complicated Excel spreadsheet, that's what they were working from. How to get, specific wines to different parts of the campus at specific times. They had little runabouts that they would deliver wine in and set it up. Very, very complicated, and that was I don't think that the laid-back winemakers could have done that. It really took the Hewlett-Packard engineers to make that happen. That was a very select group of volunteers.
And then my second question, in a previous conversation, you talked a little bit about sort of the process of getting the celebration onto the Linfield campus and overcoming the initial resistance of trustees. Could you talk a little bit about what had to happen in order to get the celebration onto the Baptist Drive campus?
Yes. Well, this is my understanding of what happened at the board meeting, that Charlie Walker, who was president at Linfield at that time, really liked the idea. He was not necessarily a wine person, but he liked the idea of Linfield being part of this community endeavor. And his wife, Sherry, is a friend, and she told me this story, which I love, that when Charlie took this proposal to the board meeting, there were a number of conservative Baptists who were saying, we don't want people drinking on campus. And one of the board members, I think Frank Spears, who was actually local from Amity and an attorney and understood the wine industry, convinced the more conservative members by telling them This is a tasting. They don't swallow it. They spit it out. It's okay. And that's what convinced them. Oh, well, okay, if they don't actually swallow it, then maybe it's okay. So I love that as an argument. And in fact, you know, that's true. We swallowed it at meals, but the tastings, we put out spit cups and people spit it out.
Great.
Thank you.
All right.